We have labeled our presentation here, Working Conditions and Work Organizations in the Creative Industry, the Netherlands, Italy and Denmark. And what we will focus on is not the creative industry as such, but on the two sectors that we have especially focused on in the project. That is the graphical design and the game development industry. In this presentation, we will focus mainly on work conditions and work organization, and there will be issues about industrial relations later. We will touch upon it briefly, but it will mainly be on work organizations and working conditions. First, we want to say something general about the findings across the three sectors, because there are so many similarities both between the two sectors and between three countries. And then we will come up with a few additional findings from each of the three specific countries. And because we obviously know the Danish case best, we will have most to say about the Danish case. There will be some repetition compared to what Luigi already have told us. I hope you will accept that. Oops. All right. I have a little bit about the two sectors, the demarcation of them. We have tried in the project to focus on companies and sectors within specific NACE codes, the graphical design, NACE code 74.10, and the game development industry, the software game publishing industry as it's called. That's NACE code 58.21. However, working on that in reality, it also became obvious to us that there are many companies within graphical design and game development that for various reasons actually are out of this sector. So we are trying to focus on these NACE codes, but in reality and for work we have broadened it out a little bit. So what can be said about work organization in general? In the context also of the industrial sector. What has already been mentioned is that they are, although there are so many similarities, they have very different histories, the two sectors here. We have the graphical design industry, which have roots in the printing industry, and that also have consequences for their industrial relation structures, which will be mentioned later on. And gaming industry, much newer industry, of course, and this is one of the differences, of course. Similarities between the two sectors, also when it comes to organization, work organization, is quite substantial. We have a very large number of small companies in the two sectors, and a very widespread use of various forms of freelancers. That is common thing from the two industries. Impact from digitalization, we already heard about that, quite obvious in the gaming industry, of course, but also very strong impact from digitalization in the graphical design. Same can be said about international competition, both the case when it comes to competition in the market of the products, but also competition in terms of labor, and both sectors are part of internationally divided labor chains. It's also highly volatile sectors. There are many startups and many closures. Of course, you have seen that in connection with their economic crisis, so-called the Great Recession, but it's actually something that's also the case in terms not of crisis. Many startups, many to try it out, but also many company closures. I think an important difference that I don't know how much will be touched upon later, but if you look at the economic turnover per employee, it is higher in gaming than it is in graphics, we would say. You simply have you earn more per employee in the gaming industry than you do in graphics, and that gives some opportunities in the sectors that can be used in different ways. These are not large sectors if you compare to the 3 countries, the total number of employees in 2 countries. It is not a large share. This is especially the case in the game developing industry, where we are talking about very, very few employees. Another commonality is project-based work. That's very much project-based work that dominates. And from this follow also a demand for flexible work organizations in all kinds of ways. You don't produce to a stable market, you don't produce to a mass production that you could where the project can be put on shelves and sold later. It's very much project-based. Right. About the working conditions, which is then strongly influenced by the work organizations that I just described. There is very much very high presence of non-standard employment in both sectors. That is both in terms of fixed-term employment, that's in terms of part-time employment, that is also maybe especially the case of self-employment or freelancers, as we mostly call it in this project. But it also ways to to pay attention to that. You could also say that unpaid work play a role in the terms of interns. Then it can be justified as part of education, but there are also people that have to work unpaid to get a foothold in the industries. What is also important, we have this multiple types of employment types, and it's not always the case that people are only performing one employment type. You can combine periods of being wage earner and self-employment, and you can also do it at the same time. That's actually quite widespread in many sectors, in many cases in the 2 sectors and the 3 countries we've been looking at. Here you also maybe interestingly find sometimes that you have a Comamore project that you do on your own as a self-employee, and then you have wage labor where you get the bread and butter, so to speak. Teamwork, project-based work, very widespread. And from that follow also sometimes a high degree of informality and flat hierarchies in terms of the different processes in the firms. Also similarity between the 2 sectors are that, and Luigi has already touched upon this, portfolios are very important. Networks, who do you know? Who can you access easily? They're very important for both your recruitment to a new job, the careers you have, and also if you are self-employed, the project contracts you can gain. So these factors are often as important, even more important, for how well you fare in these industries than your formal education. More specifically on working conditions, long working hours, something you see very often, and also already touched upon that, also the overrepresentation of young workers. This is especially the case in the gaming industry. There's also a divide within the industries where we have relatively few large companies, but in those large companies, a minority of the employees have the chance of getting a so-called typical or standard employment contract, which is open-ended and full-time contracts. Here we go. Right. Then a little bit about specificities from the 3 countries as they have been emphasized by the different project teams. And what is emphasized here is not to say that they are not important for the other countries, but this is something that has been emphasized by the national teams. The Dutch team have emphasized in both the graphical design and the game development sectors, where they find a lot of similarities, that the crisis has showed that the sectors are very sensible to economic fluctuations. They have also emphasized a growing number of freelancers and what they call indie companies. And the background for that they see in what has also been touched upon by Luigi, that it has become easier to start up your own company. They find that the wages are lower compared to what the person could earn in other sectors. And this should also be seen in the light that the rewards are not only the wages in the eyes of the employees. It's not only rewards is not only taking the form of pay, but also your portfolio is important, and also you can talk about the psychic income. I mean, the satisfaction of working with it is often seen by the worker as a reward in itself. Wage increases are in Holland negotiated individually in both sectors, but you also have a sector-based salary scale, but that's only in graphical design. The Italian team have emphasized that we actually have quite a large number of companies within the graphical design, more than 10,000 companies actually. But 99% have less than 10 employees. So that shows something about the industrial structure here. They have found decreasing wage levels due to what they describe as market saturation. There are simply so much graphical design supply that it has had an impact on downward pressure on the wage levels. They also find, with similarities also with the other countries, a spread of self-employment, and emphasize also a discontinuity of career possibilities here, in that people move in and out of self-employment, from employment and from unemployment, which creates these breaks in the careers. The Italians also find lower quality of the services, a reduced quality of the services, as they see as a result of the spread of the do-it-yourself skills and the technological development that have made it easy to work in this sector, but maybe not to produce projects on a very high quality level. And in connection to this, the Italian scene has seen a lack of recognition of professional skill within the sector. The game development, we are talking about a small sector here, 1,000 persons, including self-employees. And actually there's only a handful of companies in Italy with more than 20 employees. Interestingly here, they find that the wages compared to other European countries, game developing sectors, are lower in Italy. Where they see an increase is in the qualification structure. In the past, there were a lot of self-taught people without any formal education. Now you see more high-skilled workers in the Italian game development sector. That was Holland and Italy specific findings. Then Trine will continue with specific findings from Denmark.
Some of the findings we found from the Danish case share similarities with the situation in the Netherlands and Italy, as you already heard, but there are also some differences. One of the things we see in the Danish sectors of graphic and gaming is that the workforce is often highly educated. We're talking about academics and professionals. There are very few self-taught, And if they are, it's particularly in the graphic design industry. It used to be in the gaming industry, but their educational requirements are creeping in, and it's becoming more and more rare that people are self-taught without any educational background within IT development. What's also another characteristic of the Danish of the two sectors is that the gaming industry is very much characterized by multiculturalism and an internationalized workforce. You will see the composition of different nationalities within the gaming companies are much greater and much higher than the rest of the labor market, Danish labor market. It's slightly different in the graphic design, even though here it's also a very internationalized sector where you outsource different things and use different digital platforms to varying degrees. But the workforce itself is very domestic, and it's very difficult for foreigners to get a foothold into the Danish graphic design industry because a lot of these networks, which has been mentioned before, are created back in school or education or further higher education. And they keep relatively tight. And we can see that from the interviews we had with foreign workers working as freelancers within the graphic design, that they have very difficulties to get a foothold within the sector. Another element is that this sector is characterized by high job insecurities. And that's not just because of the widespread use of atypical employment, but it's because these two sectors are dominated by a constant search for funding and new contracts, and that results in a high company turnover, where a lot of the companies goes bust within a few years for them to reappear in a different shape. And you have a lot of small companies, as already been mentioned, and some of them might grow for a period because they land a large contract and then close down because they haven't been able to renew or get new contract fundings and closes down. What's another interesting aspect when you compare the graphic design and the gaming industry in Denmark is that you'll see that there is a labor shortage among game developers, especially those with the hardcore IT skills within the gaming sector, whereas there tends to be, similar to Italy, a certain labor surplus within the graphic design industry. That seems to have an effect on how the working conditions are for these workers in these two sectors, at least in Denmark. What we do see on the next slide, you can see we have looked at what are the wages people have. We used Danish statistical data here. What type of jobs do people hold? And what we can see is that within gaming, the salaries hourly wage is slightly higher than it is in the graphic design, but within the gaming industry, the hourly wage is considerably lower than other IT sectors. And the argument is that it's a reward in itself to work within gaming than other sectors. And you will also see when these employees get family, etc., they tend to move on to other IT sectors where they typically can earn twice as much or triple. What we also can see in the Danish case is that a lot of people, nearly 42% of the workers within graphic designs have more than one job. And that number is only a third, slightly lower in gaming, and it's about 32%. And often in the graphic designs, it's a combination, which Mikkel already mentioned, of freelance jobs with a wage-earning job that gives you the bread and butter. Already mentioned has also been atypical employment, but what's very dominant in the Danish sectors, and that's particularly in graphic design, but also gaming, is unpaid work. Internship, you do project proposals without the security of getting money for the work you have done, and then you only get paid if the company chooses to take your project or fund you. And that creates within these sectors the core and periphery workers, the group of workers which has a permanent full-time employment and a certain security, and the whole range of other workers which trying to combine different sources of income to make a living. The figures you can see here shows you how different types of atypical employment is present within the industries. The first what you call them, or column is what's called in English, is about solo self-employment, and you can see you can see that number is significantly higher within the graphic design industry compared to the gaming and creative industry overall in Denmark. The number of marginal part-timers are also considerably higher within the graphic design than the gaming industry, but slightly lower than in the creative industry overall in Denmark. Regular type of part-time employment you also see, but here the figures actually are lower than the general average of the Danish workforce, where 1 in 4 typically works part-time. But that long part-time jobs are more rare within the graphic design and gaming industries, as well as the creative industry overall. What we also see is that full-time employment is particularly widespread within gaming compared to the graphic design industry, as well as the creatives industry overall. Sorry. So that gives you a picture, an idea of how vulnerable or insecurities these workers might face, because you have to combine this with the fact that a lot of these workers and companies are searching for funding and different type of projects to be able to finance the company and their survival, secure their survival. When we move on to look at how does this affect company-based bargaining and thereby implicitly the wage setting and the working conditions at the company level. In Denmark, when we look at these two sectors, you can see that graphic design has 9 sectoral collective agreements covering the sector. It's only a small proportion of the sector that's covered by these sectoral agreements, about 1/3, whereas the gaming industry has hardly any, and if they do have company-based agreements, they're rather patchy, and you have to look very hard with a magnifier to find them. There is no tradition of employee representations within the Danish gaming sector. It's limited in the graphic design. What we also see is when you have annual appraisals, which typically form the basis for wage increases or improvement and career advancement, they take place annually within the gaming industry, but it's a rarity within the graphic design industry. What we also can see is that wage bargaining, and there's commonality across the two sectors, is that wage bargaining is individualized in both gaming and graphic design. And while it seems to be slightly more organized in the gaming sector, where it takes place annually, and you have examples of high employee involvement where actually the other employees participate in who should actually have a wage increase or not. There's very democratic procedures where they rank each other, and on that basis they jointly decide who should have more in their annual wage package. In the graphic design industry, it's a slightly different issue. The wage bargaining are rare, company-based wage bargaining are rare, and it's often a top-down approach where management is more like take it or leave it. What we also can see, and we heard from the interviewees, is that none of them have increased in salary since they started there, and some of them have been there for quite a bit of years. When we also look at other aspects is what are the different agreements and arrangements at company level, we will see again that the arrangements within the gaming sector seem slightly more advanced. There are parental leave packages, paternity leave packages, rights to flexible working, pension schemes, and caring days. In the graphic design sector, this is slightly more rare to have company-based agreements or arrangement on this. With the exception of flexible working, that's widespread. And that could have something to do with that the sectoral agreements in those companies which are covered by sectoral agreements typically regulates these particular issues. So there's no need to advance it further at company level. So to sum up, what do we find across Denmark, Italy, and the Netherlands? We see that there are many commonalities across the two sectors in all 3 countries, despite the fact they belong to different industrial relations models and have very different welfare traditions. We also see that these strong national sectoral institutions, which seems to dominate particularly in the Netherlands and Denmark, not always guarantee better wage and working conditions. We also see that there is a huge amount of atypical employment and unpaid work, which seems to contribute to increased segmentation and polarization within these sectors. And it creates these core and periphery workers, whereas those who are very good at it make it through the hierarchy and have a very nice earnings, and then you have a whole floor of workers which are slightly more disadvantaged. So thank you very much for listening.